Stravinsky wrote that music for his ballet, The Rite of Spring, over 100 years ago, but its energy and its power is still almost shocking today. Certainly, the Paris audiences of 1913 were both thrilled and repelled by the extraordinary violence of this music, and it famously, in fact, caused a riot at one of its premieres. Although, of course, that was partly to do with both the subject matter, a girl being forced to dance herself to death as part of a spring ritual, and also the extremely deliberately awkward and ugly choreography that depicted that. Why and how did music change so dramatically in the early 20th century after hundreds of years of relative stability? I always like this quotation from the slightly earlier but no less innovative French composer Claude Debussy, who says, "The century of airplanes has a right to its own music." There's no doubt that the early 20th century is an extraordinary time, both in music and the arts, and also in the context of what's going on in the wider world, as you can see from some of the things on the list there. Powered flight, Einstein, mass production, war and revolution. But at the same time, it's important to tease out what in this music is completely new and what can be understood as a continuation of trends that we can see at the end of the 19th century. In the visual arts in the same period, we see artists both depicting traditional subjects in a very new and radical way, like in this Cubist Picasso painting. And we also see artists depicting much more abstract subjects, very far away from the traditional representational art of previous centuries. And similarly, we see the early innovators in music in the 20th century. Here are Stravinsky and Debussy in a formal photograph. We see them both doing absolutely new things and also extending some of the older musical techniques and ideas. The scholar Richard Taruskin has come up with a useful term, maximalism. He uses it to describe the idea of expansion and extension of musical language. Pieces get much longer, they get larger in their forces and are expanded in all sorts of other ways as well. And this is something that isn't new in the 20th century. It's something that we see happening really throughout the Romantic period, throughout the 19th century, and in the 20th century we see it not as a new thing, but something that is taken much further. One really simple example of maximalism as we go from the classical period through the Romantic into the early 20th century is the massive expansion of orchestral forces as composers attempt to give more and more drama and weight to the pieces that they're writing. So whereas strings and double woodwind and brass and timpani are enough for Mozart in 1787, we see as we go through the next 100 or so years, composers feeling like they need more and more in order to have the impact that they want. So I'm going to play the end of Mozart's 39th Symphony, followed straight away by a snippet from towards the end of Beethoven's 9th Symphony. And you can hear the massive difference in terms of the scope and scale of what the composers are trying to do. Beethoven is capping an epic symphonic journey in 1824, whereas Mozart is finishing off a more modest, if no less brilliant, symphonic journey of his own. maximalist Wagner, a great admirer of Beethoven, and someone who really pushed the limits of the orchestra, not just in terms of its size, but in terms of the vast number of colours that he used. And of course, Wagner was a maximalist in lots of other ways too, not least in his pushing of tonality to its limits, in his insistence on having a theatre built just to perform his works, and all sorts of other extreme things that he did in his music. And then in Mahler's 8th Symphony, written at the beginning of the 20th century, we have a whole new level of maximalism. The epic scale of the symphony. Mahler once said that his symphonies need to embrace the world. And in order to cap off that sort of vastness of statement, you need this huge weight provided by this absolutely gigantic orchestra and set of choirs. Another aspect of music in which we see a process of maximalisation going right through the 19th century and into the 20th century is that of harmony and tonality. So in the 19th century, we can hear even as early as the 1850s, Franz Liszt is writing highly chromatic music in his B minor piano sonata. When you're maximalising your orchestral resources, you can, I suppose in theory, go on forever. Of course, you're constrained in the end by how large the hall is or how many players you can afford. But it's a bit different with harmony and tonality. The Chromaticism in the B minor piano sonata by Liszt is quite extreme. There are a lot of chromatic notes amongst the diatonic ones, but it does still sound pretty much in B minor. But in the end, there are only 12 notes in the chromatic scale, and there is a point beyond which you can't maximalise your use of them much further. And you can hear even in 1885, when Franz Liszt wrote his Bagatelle sans tonalité, Bagatelle without tonality, he's taken the maximalisation of use of chromaticism to such an extent that he's quite deliberately dissolving the whole sense that the piece is tonal, that the piece is in a key at all. Any sense of key then just sort of disappears in that haze of chromaticism. And of course, Liszt is deliberately using gestures that also feel fragmented and unfinished as well to heighten that sense that the piece hasn't really got a tonal centre. It's a long way from the harmony and tonality that's so much more symmetrical and stable and centred that we see in most of the rest of the 19th century. So that's two senses in which the beginning of the 20th century, the period that we're interested in, is continuing a trend of expansion, this maximalisation that we see as a thread running throughout some 19th century music. So maximalism is a way of describing some of the things that composers are doing. It's also important to understand what they're thinking, why they're doing what they're doing, and in some ways it's that which really makes the early 20th century composers stand out from their predecessors. The key word here is modernism. You might want to just pause the video while you read those two definitions of modernism from the New Grove Dictionary and from Taruskin's book about music in the early 20th century. Modernism ultimately means rejecting the past and making the art or the music that you are producing completely and very self-consciously different from what's gone before. And it's that attitude that is very important to understanding what some of the early modernist composers at the beginning of the 20th century are trying to do. This is a selection of important modernist pieces. You could make a note of these and go and listen to some of them to get a flavour of the sort of bold thing that a modernist composer might be writing. From the incredibly spiky and crystalline Webern Quartet Opus 22 from 1930, through to the extraordinary sound world Messiaen's Quartet at the End of Time, written in a prisoner of war camp in the Second World War in the early 1940s, and the barking mad Stimmung from Stockhausen, in which he explores the same chord for 40 odd minutes with different vowel sounds and different vocal sounds being made over the top of that. All really bold statements, and it's that sort of boldness that we expect and what we mean by modernist art. Another piece on that list is Schoenbergs A Barton from 1909. In it, a solo singer, accompanied by some instruments, depicts a woman who is hysterical and crazed, blundering through some woods. She may or may not have murdered her lover, but it's quite hard to tell from the text. And this highly emotional situation is depicted by very extreme music. It's highly dissonant, it's highly chromatic, it's very fragmented, it is maximalist in its approach to many aspects of the music, and particularly the harmony and tonality. An interesting example of the maximalist approach to harmony and tonality can be seen right at the end of this piece. You can see in a piano reduction here just how chromatic the music is. Chromatic scales going in all directions in doubled thirds and all sorts going on, and the piece sort of disappears into a chromatic fog at the end, a metaphor both for what's going on in the piece, but also a very good example of such a maximalist approach to chromaticism that the music sort of almost disappears into the fog of its own chromaticism. The effect looks even more dramatic on the full score. You can see all the array of instruments there proceeding in all directions in those chromatic scales as the piece finishes. Understanding these two concepts of maximalism and modernism is going to be really important to getting to grips with the composers of the early 20th century that we're studying for area of study E. We need to think about how the composers are maximalizing the resources that they have, expanding and developing on the techniques of previous composers. And also we need to think to what extent they're modernist. How interested are they in rejecting the past in that bold modernist way? And the different styles that we're looking at and the different composers that we're looking at have different approaches to those questions and issues. But for all of them, they are in some way in the background. We're looking at three particular styles from the beginning of the 20th century with area of study E, and the first of those is Impressionism, and particularly the composers Debussy and Ravel, who both take an extremely colourful and atmospheric approach to writing their music. The second style we'll be studying is Expressionism and Serialism, and the three key modernist composers, Schoenberg, Berg and Webern. This is probably the sort of music you might think of when you think of modernist music, this very spiky and quite difficult music that really defines the music of this early period of the 20th century in many people's minds. And the final style we'll be studying is Neoclassicism, which in some ways is a reaction against the extreme modernism of some previous styles. It represents a bit of a turn back towards at least some aspects of more traditional musical languages. So in this area of study, we'll be doing some unseen listening to extracts of music from those three styles and answering questions on them, a bit like in the musical theatre area of study. We'll also be looking at two relatively short set works, much shorter than the Haydn in area of study A. We'll be looking at the Debussy that we're starting this term, just the first movement of his Nocturnes for orchestra, and then a little chamber piece by Poulenc, a trio that you heard a little snippet of there. We'll be studying when we get back after the summer holidays. So lots to get our teeth into. I hope you enjoy it.